You've all heard those notes at least once in your life, if not hundreds of times. The opening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, a great piece for a full orchestra. The entire thing goes on for about half an hour. Maybe you've been lucky enough to hear a performance of a live orchestra. You can also search for it online. I encourage you to listen to the whole thing. It's a great piece. If you are a baseball fan, you know that that's what they play at Dodger Stadium every time the Dodgers strike out a visiting player. There was also a disco version made in the 70s, which became popular for a while too. So anyway, the original brings us back to our composer of the day, Ludwig van Beethoven, a man whose music needs almost no introduction. Just Beethoven's piano music alone goes down as some of the greatest music ever written. Let's see, he's got 32 piano sonatas. Let's see, this book takes up 2 books. There's so many of them. Theme and variations for a whole lot of them for piano. This is the second book of that. I left the first book at home. I have another book here of just assorted various keyboard music. Let's see. I bet you know this one. Für Elise, right? One of the most famous pieces ever. More on that later. The piano was his main instrument, so it's not surprising that he also wrote for other combinations of piano and other instruments, such as piano and violin. He wrote piano, violin, and cello. He also wrote many string quartets, several choir pieces, and, of course, 9 symphonies. I'm sure you know the main tune from his Ninth Symphony, Last Movement, sounds like this. Right, Ode to Joy, or Joyful, Joyful. And that tune is simple enough that it shows up in a lot of beginning piano books, or violin books, string books, and also wind books beginning, like clarinet and flute. So often you get to learn Beethoven your very first year of studying an instrument. Pretty cool. Maybe you enjoy listening to orchestral music. Maybe you love going to church and singing hymns with everybody. Maybe you are a baseball fan and you love going to Dodger Stadium to root on the home team. Maybe you're studying an instrument. Beethoven is in all of those places. And sadly for now, a lot of those activities are canceled. But I do know one thing for sure. The music of Beethoven has been around for over 200 years. And I am sure that 200 years from now, people will still be listening to his music. So for today's class, we're going to talk a little bit about his life. I'll give you a healthy dose of some of his music. So here we go. Some people would say that Beethoven was the greatest composer ever. Now, that brings up an interesting question. Who is the greatest composer ever? Well, if you ask a bunch of different people, you'll probably get a bunch of different answers. I personally would put Bach, last week's composer, at the top of my list, and Beethoven, I would say he is about equal in importance and brilliance to Bach, so it's hard for me to decide. Some people would say Mozart's the greatest composer ever, because Mozart was such a talented genius. He could write music almost effortlessly. For Mozart, it was like breathing. Beethoven had to put a little more effort into his compositions, but I do know that the very best of Beethoven is at the top of my list. Beethoven was born in 1770 in the city of Bonn, which is in Germany. He was born into a musical family, and from a very early age, his father taught him how to play piano and violin. And you might think, wow, Beethoven was so lucky to have a father who taught him these things. Well, yes, that's partially true, but also Beethoven's childhood was not the happiest, because his father was not only a strict teacher, but cruel. He would beat up Beethoven and lock him in a closet if he ever made mistakes. And face it, every student makes mistakes. I still mess up, right? So Beethoven was locked in a closet for that. Now his father was also thinking in his mind of Mozart, another musician who'd come around quite a few years earlier. Mozart was a child genius who performed at an early age all over Europe for kings, queens, royalty, and Mozart made lots of money in the process. So I bet Beethoven's father was thinking, I have a son who's talented. Maybe if I teach him, he could be the next Mozart. Well, Beethoven was Beethoven, not Mozart. And young Beethoven loved making up pieces at the piano. So he would sit down and make up a piece. And his father would say, "Oh no, I don't want to hear that. You're not ready for that yet." So he wasn't allowed to make up his own pieces. Now, any of you who are learning an instrument, or if you like to sing, I invite you all to make up your own pieces. It's fun. I still do that. It's great. It's a great way to express yourself. So, but I'm not Beethoven's father. All right, back to Beethoven. In addition to having an abusive father, Beethoven also had his share of family tragedy. He had several siblings who died young at age 2 or 3. And then also when Beethoven was 16, his mother passed away, and he also lost a baby sister that year too. So now this was a long time ago. They didn't have the modern medicine and vaccines that we have today. So childhood death was fairly common back then. Beethoven became famous, first of all, as a pianist, especially as an improviser, which meant he would make up his own pieces. However, even though he was so good at this, he often didn't like to play in front of a live audience. Once he was playing for an audience, the audience was in one room. Beethoven was in another room where no one could see him. But someone from the audience peeked in on Beethoven to watch him play. Beethoven saw that person and took his hat and ran out of the room. Another time, he was sitting in a room with a countess. That's somebody who's royal blood, so kind of up high. The countess was on her knees begging Beethoven, "Please play for me," and Beethoven refused. He just sat on the couch. So he didn't always like to play in front of people. Beethoven also at one point said words were awkward for him and that he felt more comfortable with music than with words. So what was Beethoven like as a person? Well, he may have been difficult to deal with at times, but Beethoven also had a very high sense of morality, meaning that he believed in keeping your word, being honest, and nothing angered him more than a broken promise. So telling the truth was very important to him. He always kept a sketchbook nearby, so whenever a musical idea would come to him, he could write it down right away. He moved around a lot because he often found something to complain about wherever he lived. So he would move from place to place. He never married or had any children. So his only family, after his parents had passed away, he did have 2 younger brothers. And there's an interesting story about his brothers. One of them, Carl, he could call by name. The other one, he couldn't say the name of his brother. Even when writing a note, a letter, he would write to Carl, and there would just be a blank line where the name of his brother was. That was Nicholas Johann was the name of the other brother. So he would write Carl and for his other brother. We can't talk about Beethoven without mentioning one important thing that happened to him when he was about 30 years old. He started to lose his hearing. So this absolutely tortured him as a musician. To lose your hearing, which is about the most important thing. Often it started gradually at first. He would be with a friend, and his friend might say, "Oh, do you hear in the distance? I think I hear a flute." And Beethoven heard nothing. So he didn't like that at all. Eventually, it was harder and harder for him to hear, and he had to use what were called ear trumpets. So this is a little bit crude, but okay. I've got a rolled up piece of paper. If I stick this in my ear and someone screams, I might be able to hear. Right now, Beethoven's ear trumpets were probably made out of metal, but this is the idea. So eventually someone would scream, Beethoven would hear and reply back. Eventually the ear trumpets didn't work anymore, and he started using conversation books, meaning that a friend would come over to visit, and the friend would write something down. Beethoven would look at it, write back his reply, then his friend would read it. So it would be a conversation, but all written down. Now, at this point, Beethoven was becoming more well known as a composer, and eventually he just stopped performing in public altogether. So you might be wondering, how can somebody write music when they can't hear? Well, it's important to remember that when Beethoven was growing up, learning how to read and write music, he could hear just fine. So he learned, like anybody with regular hearing range, growing up. Let me demonstrate with words and see if this helps you. Okay, you don't have to be a literary genius to know what these would sound like. Let me see, I'll just point at these words. Can you kind of hear that in your head? Hello. Is that what you thought the first one would sound like? Me too. The second one's going to sound a little different, right? Hello. It has an exclamation point. The third one is going to go up a little at the end. Hello? Question mark. And I bet you could also do this with rhyming words. In fact, you could probably make up a poem without even saying it out loud and knowing which words would rhyme in your head. So now let me try to demonstrate with music. Let's take a song that you all know, Happy Birthday, which Beethoven didn't write. If I sing just the first phrase, Happy birthday to you. Right, you've heard that. Now what if I take out you? Happy birthday to. Can you kind of hear in your head you? How about if I just do the beginning? Happy birthday. Can you hear the rest of that phrase continuing in your brain? That's kind of how Beethoven used his brain. He didn't need his actual ears, but he could hear inside his head. Kind of like if you've ever heard music or talking in a dream. It's that idea. And Beethoven had studied the sounds of the music so intently growing up that he knew what they all sounded like, and he didn't need to be able to hear to express himself. So hopefully that helps. Okay, now we're ready to listen to some of Beethoven's music. Just before we do that, I wanted to show you what some of his musical handwriting looked like. This is super messy, right? Now, I don't know what piece this is. If it's probably not the final copy. It looks like it's maybe a sketch or working copy, but it just gives you an idea of his process. He didn't use pencil and eraser. He wrote everything in pen. So as you can see, if he messed up, he would just scribble it out. So anyway, it's almost a miracle that anybody could read this. All right, now it's time to get into his music. Für Elise, one of Beethoven's most famous pieces ever, right? It was written in 1810. Now at this point, Beethoven was pretty much deaf, couldn't hear anymore. He was 40 years old at this point. And Elise, we're not even sure exactly who Elise was. It might have been the daughter of Beethoven's doctor. It might have been a soprano. We're not even sure. And in fact, although this piece is so famous today, while Beethoven was alive, nobody, except for maybe Beethoven and Elise, knew about this piece. It was not discovered until 1867. Now, by this time, Beethoven had already been dead for 40 years, because he died in 1827. So, in 1867, somebody found this piece written down and said, oh, this is a great piece. And then it became published and became famous. And actually, after that, someone lost the original manuscript. So we don't even have Beethoven's original copy of the music. Maybe it'll turn up someday. We don't know. But in the meantime, we have this piece. Now, I can see why it's so popular today. Beethoven was known for all these big, long, dramatic works, either for piano or for orchestra, amazing works. This piece is just 3 pages, but it's popular because it has several different elements of Beethoven's style, all kind of compressed into a tidy little package. So let's talk about it. After the opening section, the next part is quite a contrast. It's a more like beautiful, melodic singing section with a little bit of a fancy run at the end. Ah, back to the part we know, right? So after that first section comes back again, there's a third section, which is another hallmark of Beethoven's style. Now this third section is kind of dark, brooding, stormy, mysterious, right? We're not sure exactly what's going to happen. It's got a lot of repeated notes in the left hand. And then after all those notes, it changes, it goes up again. And then after all this motion, a rest, a pause. And then we don't know what's going to happen. So this section has a lot of drama. Back to the final section. Then Beethoven finally ends it all. Here's one of his piano sonatas that's got a somewhat famous opening. Now, I never officially learned this piece, but I'll just do the best I can. It starts slow in the beginning, and then when you turn the page, things pick up. So on, that continues for a while, then turn the page. I'll play a little of the next movement too, because that one's also pretty famous. All right, that sonata is called the Pathétique, which is a nickname that Beethoven didn't come up with, but somebody else did after he'd already written it. Speaking of nicknames, this is one of Beethoven's most famous piano movements ever. I'm sure most of you have heard it before. And again, Beethoven just wrote the music. Someone else gave it the nickname. So this is the beginning of the Moonlight Sonata. The last movement of the Moonlight Sonata is also pretty famous. I can't play the whole thing for you because I never learned it. I'm just going to try the opening bit to give you a taste. And that's where I have to stop. And you might think, well, how did I learn this piece if I never played it? I learned another Beethoven piece that had some of the same patterns in it. It had this pattern coming down with my right hand and my left hand. And when I first started working on that Beethoven piece, I didn't play that so well. So I practiced in both hands in all 12 keys. Up and down, right? For a long time until I had that pattern down. So that's something that Beethoven used in several of his pieces. So I can play that part, but not the rest of it. And here's what you just heard me attempting to play in Beethoven's own handwriting, the last movement of his Moonlight Sonata. And you can see here, even though it's a little bit messy, you can see the left hand, right, going along just 2 notes. And then there's that pattern going up in the right hand. And then there's a repeat sign that's a little bit hard to make out, but remember Beethoven was kind of messy. So there it is, his own handwriting. Opus 27, number 2. So let's talk about what does opus mean anyway? It sounds like such a fancy word, opus. The word opus just means work in Latin. Opus means work. So a composer, Beethoven wrote a lot of pieces growing up as a student. He didn't think too much of them. Then finally he wrote a piece that he's like, oh, this is really something. I'm going to call that Opus 1. And then the next big piece that he wrote, he's like, oh, this is a serious piece. Let me call that Opus 2. And so he keeps on going up, Opus 3, Opus 4. And it doesn't matter what the piece is. It could be like his first symphony, I believe, is Opus 21. And then I don't know what Opus 22 is. It could be a string quartet or anything. And then Opus 27 was actually 2 sonatas for piano. So the first one is Opus 27 number 1. The second sonata in that opus is Opus 27 number 2, the Moonlight. So I hope that was clear. If it doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. It's just opus is a way of him keeping track of what he's writing, and then we know about when he wrote it in his life as well. So then you're going to hear me play a little bit from Opus 53 coming right up. Here's another one of his piano pieces. I'm going to play just the opening first few measures so you can hear how much drama there is right at the very beginning. That's just the beginning. The last piece I'm going to play for you today is a complete movement from one of his sonatas. So remember, a sonata just means a piano piece that's made up of more than one movement. A lot of his sonatas have 3 movements. Some of the shorter ones, there's only a few short ones, have 2 movements. And then Beethoven's actually important in expanding the sonata into a big work. So a lot of his later piano sonatas had 4 movements. So what you're going to hear is a movement called the scherzo. I thought that would be a good one to end with. Scherzo comes from a word that means joke in Italian. So it's kind of a funny, lighthearted piece to show that Beethoven did have some lighthearted moments with all the storming and brooding. It's Opus 31, number 3, which sounds intimidating. But remember, opus just means work. So it means it's from the 31st work that Beethoven wrote. So that doesn't sound so bad. In his 31st work, or opus, there were 3 pieces. So the first one was a piano sonata, Opus 31, number 1. The next one was Opus 31, number 2. And then this piece that has the scherzo in it is Opus 31, number 3. So I hope that's a little bit more clear. Also in this piece, it's very exciting because let's do a quick dynamic review. We've got forte, right, for strong or loud. Piano, meaning soft. In the middle, we've got mezzo piano, mezzo forte. In this scherzo, Beethoven takes out the middle. There's not much middle. It's mostly piano or pianissimo. Issi in Italian means a lot, right? So it means piano, but a lot. Piano, so super pianissimo. So it's bubbling along at piano, pianissimo. Then fortissimo is about as loud as you can play. And there's 4 spots in this piece where you're going to hear me play loud fortissimo chord out of nowhere. But most of the time I'm bubbling along here. We sometimes get a crescendo up to forte. But a lot of dynamic contrast, which is great for Beethoven's style. And this piece, I first learned it about 25, 30 years ago. And I haven't really played it a whole lot since then. So I had to dust it off for this Beethoven series, but so excuse a few of my fumbles. So here it is. Alright, I hope you've had fun exploring the life and music of Beethoven, one of the greatest composers ever. He wrote an awful lot of music, couldn't get to it all today, of course, but you can check it out in your spare time. In fact, we didn't even touch on his Ninth Symphony, one of his greatest works, possibly his greatest work. I could spend weeks just talking about that piece. So why don't we end in style with the very end of his Ninth Symphony.